What's up guys, Jay Yudlowski, Focus Photography and Design, helping you focus on your photography. So I wanted to start a little series here on the exposure triangle, ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and just help you understand what they do, how they work, and how they all relate to each other. So today I want to start by talking about ISO. So let's get into it. So what is ISO? ISO is the sensitivity of the image sensor within your camera to light. So the more light that there is in the environment that you're in, the lower you can keep your ISO. For example, if you're outside on a bright sunny day, you can have your ISO very low, say around 100 or 200. And then with that low ISO, you'll be able to get the other settings that you need to get great pictures. As it starts to get darker in your environment, say it's a cloudy day, maybe you need to bump your ISO up to say 400 or 800. And as you get into darker environments, maybe when you come inside a house, even though it may look bright to the eye, to the camera, it looks dark. So you're gonna have to bump that ISO up a little bit higher. Inside, you might need to use 1600 and 3200 if your camera can hold up when you go that high. Now, one of the factors that affects the image quality, as you raise that ISO higher and higher, your image gets noise or grain. Now sometimes it doesn't look that bad, and there's a point, you know, for each camera it's different, but there's a point where that grain just looks like a little too much and you don't want to really take pictures above a certain ISO. For example, on my Canon 60D that I had, it was a crop sensor camera, I would bring that one up to maybe 1600 ISO if I was shooting images for clients. For my own personal use, I might bring it up to 3200 at most. And the highest that camera went to was 6400, and those images were pretty much unusable. So it wasn't very often that I brought images up to 6400 ISO. Now with my 5D Mark IV Canon camera that I have, at 6400, the images are great out of here and I can use them, no problem. And below that, the noise and the files are all very clean. So what I want to do is just try and explain it a little bit through looking at some images and just show you different ISOs and what the images look like, what the noise looks like, what the grain looks like. So let's head on over to the computer now and I'll run through some images at different ISOs and just give you examples of what the different ISOs look like, what the type of light, the ambient light, the environment light that I was in, and why I chose the ISO that I did. So let's head on over to the computer and check that out. Real quick, before we jump over to Lightroom, I wanted to pit stop here in Photoshop and just show you what noise looks like in case you're not familiar with what noise looks like. So here in Photoshop, I have a black background, and I can apply some noise right here through a filter in Photoshop so I can show you what it would look like. So I'm going to come to the filter menu, noise, add noise. Now I'm going to start with this all the way down. Now you can think of the noise slider here, if it's all the way to the left, you can think of that as a low ISO. So you can see you don't really see anything, you see a black background. Now as I raise this amount up, you can think of that as raising your ISO higher and higher. So whereas this maybe is 100 or 200, maybe you raise it up a little. Maybe there's 400 or 800. Maybe there's 1600, and you can see the noise is the speckles in the image, or the grain is what it actually is. And here you can see the grain in this image is black and white. You can see if I raise it up a little more, you can get a real good idea of what it looks like. Now, in some images, sometimes you're going to have grain that is colored. So here it's different colored noise, and that can really ruin an image, can really make it look muddy and unclear. As you get higher ISO and you get more of this color noise, it really takes away from the image and eventually will make the image unusable. So the color noise is something we definitely want to stay away from. And one way you can fix this is if you make the image black and white, and then it just becomes a nice grain or noise, depending on how much is in the image. So now that you've got an understanding of what the noise and the grain look like, let's go take a look at some images that might be affected by noise or grain. Here we are in Lightroom, and what I'm going to do is just take you through some different images to show you examples of pictures that I've taken at different ISOs, just to show you the difference between various ISOs. And I also want to show you the noise that comes in as you get into a higher ISO. First set of images that I have here are going to be shot at 100 ISO. So 100 ISO will give you the cleanest image that you can get off your camera sensor, the least amount of noise in the image, and typically you would use these settings on, say, a bright sunny day. Here's a picture at the beach. At the beach, you get the bright sun, hardly any clouds in the sky, and I'm definitely going to use an ISO of 100 on an image like this. Now here's the beach in the evening, and on this one I used 100 ISO because I wanted to be able to make my shutter speed a little longer, which gives you the movement in the waves. You can see a little bit of motion blur in the waves there, but this 100 ISO will also give me a very clean file with little noise, and in this case, since it was a little bit darker out in the evening, it allowed me to have a longer shutter speed, which allowed for the water to blur here and get some nice motion blur going on. And here's another final one. We got a T-Rex here. So this image here, again, bright daylight. There was blue skies, very little clouds, and I was able to use an ISO of 100 here to give me the best quality file that I could get. Next, let's move on to ISO 400. So ISO 400 you might use if it's a little bit, I wouldn't say dark out, but if it's a little cloudy, if there's some clouds in the sky, if you're inside, but it's very bright inside, it's likely you're going to need an ISO of at least 400. I feel like it's very rare that I shoot with an ISO of 100 inside, but outside, 400 is a common ISO that I would shoot at. So here is an image. I took a picture of a bubble that's down in some plants here, so it was a little dark, within the inside of the plants. And so I decided to use an ISO of 400 so that way I could get the proper exposure or assist in getting the proper exposure. Again, it's important to remember that the exposure it's all a combination of your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. And I'll kind of talk to that as we go through the next few videos here. But just starting with ISO and understanding at what light conditions do you use what ISO, and having an idea of how to do that, I think is very helpful. Next image here at 400 ISO, we have this little panda guy that I took a picture of at the zoo. So you can see here he's in the shade. In the background here you have the sun. So it's bright in the background, but where this little guy was sitting was quite shady. So in order to get a shutter speed where he wouldn't be blurry, I had to boost up my ISO a little bit, and in this case I used an ISO of 400. Here's another one where I used an ISO of 400. This is inside train car, obviously. Now inside the car you can see it was bright sunny day outside, and I didn't have a flash or anything, so I had to raise my ISO a little bit, and that way it enabled me to get a good exposure inside the train. Next we go to 800 ISO. So here we have a picture of the fireplace and the baby here, and here in this room, it was fairly dim. The only light coming into the room was through the front door that was over on the left-hand side here, and that's how the baby was lit here. And to get some of the detail and see what was going on a little bit in the background there, I needed to bump up my ISO again, so I used an ISO of 800 to help me capture this image. Another image here, it's one of my daughters, and taking a picture here looking down on her. She's standing by a sliding glass window, so there was a bunch of light coming in, but it was dark out, it was cloudy out. It wasn't dark, it was cloudy out. So to get the proper exposure, with us being on the inside of the door and no lights on in the room, I needed to raise my ISO up, and that allowed me to get a good exposure in her face and good exposure in her eyes, and you can really see the color of her eyes there. And to get the shutter speed I needed to raise the ISO so I could get a good, clean, sharp image. Again, another picture at 800 ISO here, looking out onto a deck. It was raining, and obviously overcast and cloudy. The rain's coming down, and I opened up a back door that we had, looked outside, and thought it would make a cool picture to see the water splashing in the puddles. So I had to raise my my ISO to 800 in order to get a shutter speed that was high enough to kind of freeze some of the motion here of the water falling. Here's another picture that I just took. This was from this year, this Christmas, and in the room that I was in, it was fairly dark. had to use an ISO of 800, even though it looks like it's bright in the background here. Things that look bright to your eye are not bright to the camera's eye. You know, you can be in a room inside and you're like, well, it's pretty bright in here. You know, there's a lot of light. But as soon as you take out your camera and you go to take a picture, I noticed this especially with my 60D. The 5D Mark IV obviously is much better in lower light. But with my 60D, as the light dropped, it was much harder to get clean pictures without noise and grain as the light, you know, got lower. So in this one, you know, I used an ISO of 800. Next shot here, we have an owl in a barn. It's a barn owl, I believe. And inside the barn, obviously, it was a little dark. And, you know, I was able to capture this image at 1600 ISO. I had to bring it up a little bit just to, you know, be able to get a proper exposure and be able to see the owls here in the barn. And here's at our church. Help run the soundboard there from time to time, and the audio-visual stuff, help take photographs for them. And here, even with the chandeliers on and all the house lights on that you see on the ceiling there, the church is still relatively dark. So this image was taken at 1600 ISO, and a lot of times I even really needed to raise my ISO a little bit higher if I was taking pictures within the sanctuary here. Now, there was a lot of lights on the stage, which helped if you were taking pictures on the stage, but when you're trying to get room shots or pictures of people in the room or the room itself and anything that might be set up, there just wasn't a lot of light, although to your eye, it might seem like there was a decent amount of light in there. But to the camera's eye, there just was not a lot of light in there. And then again, here, another shot in a basement. You can see there's not a lot of light down in here. It was kind of dimly lit. There was, I think, one overhead light off to the right, and these boots were being lit by that. And you can see in the background, you know, it's just dark back there. There's light coming down the stairs over here. But as we zoom in one-to-one a little bit, you're starting to see the grain here in the background. You know, it's blurry, but you're starting to see it a little bit. Not too bad, not too noticeable. Most people probably wouldn't notice anything. So moving up to 3200 ISO. Here we've got a picture of a frog at 3200. Now there's some decent light on him, but the cage that he was in was pretty dark. So we, you know, I need to bump it up to 3200, and this was on my 60D, and it came out okay because there was enough light on the frog here. Again, another zoo exhibit, but you know, these exhibits are dark if you've ever been to a museum, and you can see kind of the grain in there, and it even looks a little fuzzy almost at 3200 ISO. Here was inside like a big barn building. This guy was having model trains set up and checking out his train set. And in here, it was very dim. And if I zoom in here, you can start to see a little grain in the background. It doesn't look too bad. It's not very distracting. I mean, I don't mind this at all. I think it's okay. Again, if I was shooting for clients, I don't know if I would want to shoot at 3200 on my 60D. On my 5D Mark IV, I think 3200 is no problem. Next image here, Santa Claus on the train. Now here you're starting to see, you know, in his jacket here, without any noise reduction. Again, I went through and turned off all the noise reduction on these images, so that way you're seeing the true noise that was captured with the camera. You can see it's looking grainy here in his jacket, in the darker areas here. If I zoom in at 2:1 here, then you can really start to see some of the grain. Now, again, if you use a little bit of the noise reduction in Lightroom or Photoshop or any of the other programs, that helps to cut down the noise and does a pretty good job and can actually, you know, save some images or make it usable. Now, here's an image I shot at 3200 this was in that same church that you saw a picture of earlier. Now, I wanted a silhouette of this kid who was playing bass. Now, we had some nice lights in the background there. So I was able to use 3200, capture a nice image of the lights in the background, and have this kid silhouetted here. And all in all, that's still a pretty clean file. You know, the edge of him looks nice and sharp. And in the background, you see a little bit of grain, but not too bad. Picture here was at a birthday party that I took some photos of, and here was a garage. It was actually set up in a garage with just Christmas lights. That's the only lighting there was. There was Christmas lights strung around. So there wasn't much light available. And for the 60D, you know, it was a struggle to get images in this environment. So 3200 was where I need to be with that image. Moving on to 6400. So I believe most of these now are shot with my 5D Mark IV. So here on the 5D Mark IV, you can see it's pretty clean file. You see a little bit of grain in there, but really not a big deal. Nothing that anybody would even notice. Again, here's another one, 5D Mark IV 6400. Now this is inside. It looks nice and bright in here, but to the camera's eye, it wasn't as bright, as it was to the human eye. So I needed to use 6400 ISO to capture this image here of the maple syrup. And you can see it's a very clean image. It's very sharp. Now we're moving up to 8000 ISO. So when I first got the Canon 5D Mark IV back at the end of 2017, I wanted to test it out. This was actually one of the first times that I went out and used the camera. So I wanted to see how would this thing perform at night. It was a tree lighting ceremony, and I just wanted to see how would it perform. Because I know with my 60D crop sensor camera, a few years old now, I would have walked away with no images from this. Even if I used my 50mm 1.4 aperture lens, I wouldn't have been able to boost my ISO high enough where the image sensor would be able to catch enough light to make images. Got a fire truck, 8000 ISO. Now if you zoom in, you do see a little bit of grain here. We can zoom in here. We go into 2:1. So you can see some grain there, but in reality, it's not that bad. I mean, you could probably print this and you wouldn't even notice. It'd probably be fine. Here's a picture at 10,000 ISO on the 5D Mark IV. You can see a little bit of grain in there and even in the background here a little bit. But again, it's not very noticeable. It's really not that bad. The file holds up pretty well in my opinion. And if you turned on some noise reduction in Lightroom here, that would really take care of a majority of that noise for you. Moving up, we are at 12,800 ISO. So out here, it was a very dim orange light coming across this little scene here. And, I decided to try at 12,800. And I was pretty impressed that the file looked this good. Moving up to 16,000 ISO. Here we had a bunch of carolers. There was one light behind them. So you can imagine the light there, it's bright behind them, and then they're all in shadow, their faces all in shadow. So in order to get an exposure where I could see them even a little bit, as we do in this image, I had to boost up the ISO to 16,000 to really allow that sensor to capture any little bit of light that was shining on the front of their faces. 20,000 ISO. Here, there was no lights here. A couple people had cell phones held up, iPhones with the little light on the front, and that's what was lighting this guy here. And I was impressed that this camera was able to capture anything. So as you can see, we kind of went through a bunch of different scenarios, different images, and you saw how the light level went down. We needed to raise up the ISO. Now again, you're going to be able to do other things in addition to ISO, but right now I just want to focus on ISO and help you see how you need to adjust it when the light diminishes and goes down. All right, so now that we've gone through and looked at some images with various ISOs and saw how we can use a low ISO when it's very bright outside or bright in our environment, and how as the light comes down in our environment, we need to raise our ISO up. So let's talk about how do we practice using ISO? How do we try out different ISOs and see what the effect is on our pictures? So I'm going to show you using my Canon 60D on how I would do that. One of the best ways to do that is to check out the mode dial on your camera here and set it to the P mode. You'll see a P on here. And what that means is program mode. So what that's going to do is it's going to have the camera make all the decisions for the aperture and the shutter speed, and it's going to allow you to select the ISO. So put your camera in the P mode, and that'll allow you to adjust just the ISO. Now, if you're not sure how to adjust the ISO on your particular camera, take a look in the manual, Google it on YouTube. I'm sure you can find a video of somebody telling you exactly which buttons are what. On my 60D here on the top, I have a little ISO button, and I can just press that and change my ISO. I can also go through the menus in the menu system and change my ISO there. And you want to go out and just start taking pictures. Take some inside your house, take some outside, and look at how the ISO affects your image. Now, you're probably going to get a decent exposure most of the time because your camera will adjust the other two parts of the exposure triangle, which are the shutter speed and the aperture. Once you bring your images into your computer, you can take a look at them, zoom in on them, and you'll see, some of them will get grainy, some of them will be too blurry, because in the environment that you're in, if you use a lower ISO, for example, and it's dark, your camera is going to compensate with a slower shutter speed, and then your image is going to be blurry. So you would know that in that particular situation, you'd need to raise up your ISO. So I think that gives you a good start on how to understand ISO and how to practice it. I know for me, when I first was trying to go through all these manual settings, I had an idea of what each one did, but it wasn't until I just sat down and practiced it and tried it and practiced and took pictures, took tons of pictures, tons of terrible pictures for a long time, until you understood and saw how each element of the exposure triangle affected your image. So I want to thank you for stopping by and checking out my YouTube video. Please subscribe. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next video where we'll be talking about Aperture. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.